I drove out to eastern Oregon in early November 2020, aiming for the high desert. My plan was simple: isolation shots. Long exposures of the sky, abandoned land, stretches of sand and sage that felt untouched. I needed silence, space, and nothing between me and the horizon. The Bureau of Land Management land I picked was legal to camp on, but the road getting there was little more than gravel with deep ruts. And by the time I parked, I could see for miles in every direction without a single structure or person in sight. It was cold, the air dry and brittle, with a wind that bit my ears even when I zipped my hood tight. I carried only my camera gear, tripod, small tent, sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, and enough food and water for a few days. I wanted nothing more than to set up and start shooting. The first night, I laid out the tripod on a flat patch near a small hill that broke the otherwise level landscape. The stars were incredible, more than I had ever seen from anywhere I'd been before. I spent hours adjusting exposures, tracking the movement of the sky, testing compositions. My camera was warm when I went to bed, fully charged. I remember waking once and hearing the wind sweep across the desert, the faint hiss of sand across rocks. Everything was still, and the isolation was complete. I slept in small stretches, waking and dozing off in turns, feeling more like part of the land than a separate presence. In the morning, I found the batteries dead, though I had charged them fully the night before. I blamed the cold at first. I swapped in spares and packed up to scout further for the next night's setup. The desert changed subtly with the angle of the sun. Shadows stretched long across cracked earth and sparse vegetation. A small dry wash ran through the area, little more than a sandy gully, but it shaped the wind and light in ways that made the land look different each hour. By afternoon, I found a new spot closer to the ridge, a spot with a clear horizon and minimal interference for long exposures. I set up my tripod again, tested angles, and left the camera running for a short exposure while I walked around, examining rocks and low brush, finding textures to use as foregrounds. The air remained sharp and dry, the sun sinking fast. When I returned, the camera had shifted slightly. I adjusted it, double-checked the battery, and went back to the tent to eat and rest. That night, the same thing happened. By morning, every battery was drained. I checked connections, tried different outlets in my portable charger, but nothing explained it. The third night, I stayed awake longer, walking the ridge and mapping the terrain in my mind. The desert was quiet, the occasional crow or distant bird the only sound during the day, but at night it was emptiness. Around midnight, I set up my camera for a long exposure, aiming at the ridge where shadows played across rocks and scrub. I noticed shallow trenches forming in the sand near where I had placed the tripod. At first, I assumed wind or small animals, but the arcs were too deliberate, too consistent. Something had been dragged repeatedly in the same patterns. I examined them with my flashlight, following the lines across the sand, measuring roughly a foot in width. Nothing matched footprints or claw marks, and no tracks led to or from the trenches. They seemed to start and end at the tripod itself, encircling it. I stayed close to the tent, alert. Around 3:40 a.m., I heard a sound across the hard, packed ground. It wasn't footsteps. There was no rhythm, no impact of shoes or paws. It sounded like a body being pulled, fast and without resistance, scraping lightly against stone and grit. I switched on my headlamp, sweeping the beam across the immediate area. The sound stopped instantly. Nothing moved. No shadows, no forms. Only the wind brushing the sparse bushes. My heart was hammering, though I told myself it was just imagination, the desert playing tricks in the dark, shapes and sounds shifting in my mind. I checked the camera the next morning. Every memory card I had was corrupted except one. I almost didn't look at it, half afraid of what I might see, but I did. The single photo that survived was taken during one of my sleeping periods. It showed a low, blurred shape in the sand near the tripod. I could make out little detail, but the contours were unmistakable. Something was there, close to the ground, crouched or crawling. I studied the surrounding terrain in the image, compared it to the trenches I had noticed the night before. The arc lines matched almost perfectly. My stomach sank. I had no idea what it was, and part of me didn't want to know. I spent the following day breaking down my camp slowly, staying alert. I packed every piece of gear, every camera, every battery with care, checking the surroundings constantly. I moved cautiously, never straying far from the tent. The desert seemed quieter than usual, or maybe I was too tense to notice. When I finally drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see movement along the ridge, a shadow tracking the car. Nothing appeared. I did not stop until I reached the first paved road, then the next town, then my apartment. The desert faded behind me, but the image stayed in my mind. The trenches, the dragging sound, the single blurred figure. I never returned to that spot. Weeks later, I went over the photos from my trip on a larger monitor, analyzing exposures, settings, compositions. The majority of the frames were ruined, scratched pixels, random lines of static across the images, as though the sensor had been tampered with while the camera was inactive. I realized the one photo that survived wasn't perfect. It was a reminder that something had interacted with my equipment while I slept. I never figured out what, but I began leaving batteries in the car and using more robust cases for my cameras. I researched local wildlife and terrain, but found nothing that could explain the movements or the marks in the sand. Coyotes, foxes, or bobcats moved differently. Nothing could drag itself across sand in arcs without leaving clear, connecting tracks, and nothing could override electronics without interference at the level I experienced. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain it. I documented the experience for myself, the way I might record a strange natural phenomenon. I returned to photography trips in remote areas, but never alone. I always made sure someone knew my location, and I avoided the high desert during long nights. The memory of those trenches, the dragging sound, and the single blurred image stayed with me. It was tangible, unsettling, and real, though I could not identify the source. That clarity, the certainty that something had been there close to me, left a lasting imprint. I photographed again, but the desert no longer felt empty. It felt alive, in a slow, deliberate way, and I never underestimated that silence again. I went because I was broke and tired of making decisions while standing under buzzing warehouse lights. I had quit my job in Spokane without notice, walked out with my lunch bag still in my locker, and drove east with no plan beyond not going back to my parents yet. I wanted a pause that did not cost money. At the library, I printed a forestry map that showed a free dispersed site in northern Idaho, marked only by a brown post and a number. No name, no reservation system, no ranger station listed. That felt right at the time. It felt like a place where nothing was expected of me. The road off the highway was narrow and rutted, packed dirt with patches of gravel that rattled the car. I drove for almost an hour without seeing another vehicle. The trees closed in and blocked most of the sky. Late August light filtered down in thin columns. When I reached the marker, I almost missed it. The post leaned slightly, and the number was faded. There was no signboard, no rules, no trash bins. A short spur led into a clearing big enough for one vehicle and a tent. The site looked unused for a long time. The fire ring had slumped into itself. Rocks were half buried. Old foil was melted into the ash, silvered and black, fused like it had been there through many seasons. Someone had nailed a strip of reflective tape to a tree at eye level. It caught the light when I turned the engine off. It did not make sense because headlights would not reach that far in. The tape faced inward, toward the clearing, not the road. I noticed it and then stopped thinking about it. I set my tent on a patch of packed soil that had been flattened before, though I could not tell how long ago. Pine needles were thin there, ground down to dust. I cooked rice on a small stove and ate it straight from the pot. The air smelled clean but flat, like rain had passed days earlier and taken everything with it. I heard no birds, no insects, no wind moving the branches. The stillness felt like pressure in my ears. I blamed it on my mood. Night came fast under the trees. I zipped the tent and lay on my back, listening for the usual sounds to return. They did not. I slept in short stretches and woke often, checking the time on my phone until the battery warning flashed. I turned it off to save power. Around 2:10 a.m., I woke to a sound that cut through the quiet. Something was being dragged across dirt. It moved slowly with pauses. Stop, scrape, stop. The sound traced a wide path around the clearing. It never came close enough for me to hear footsteps. There was no crunch of leaves, no snap of a twig. Only the scrape, like a heavy object on its side. I stayed still, counting breaths, trying to map the circle by sound alone. It took several minutes to complete one pass. Then it started again. I did not unzip the tent. I did not turn on a light. I pressed my ear against the thin fabric and felt the vibration more than I heard it. The path stayed consistent, the distance even. Whatever it was never crossed the cleared center. It did not touch the tent. It kept its ring. The sound stopped before dawn. I did not know when sleep took me again. Morning came gray and cool. I waited before moving, listening. The woods remained empty. When I stepped out, the ground told the story in a way the night had not. Wide drag marks formed an almost perfect ring around where I slept. The soil was smooth and compressed, as if something long and heavy had been pulled on its side. There were no footprints inside or outside the ring. No heel marks. No toe marks. The drag path crossed pine needles and left them flattened and dark. In places, it shaved the top layer of dirt away to a lighter color beneath. I followed the ring with my eyes and then with my feet, careful not to step on it. The circle was centered on the fire ring and my tent. It was not sloppy. It was deliberate. The width stayed consistent. There were no gouges from a corner or an edge. Whatever made it had weight and a rounded surface. I packed slowly, telling myself there was a simple explanation. Someone could have pulled a log to mark the site. Someone could have dragged a tarp. Animals could do strange things. I kept telling myself that until the smell reached me. It was faint, like iron and old fat warmed by the sun. It came from the edge of the clearing where the trees thickened. I followed it a few steps and stopped. The ground there was darker. Flies rose and settled again. Under a layer of branches, I saw hide, brown and coarse, with a clean-cut edge. Not rot. Fresh. A strip of flesh still clung to it. The size suggested elk or moose. Too big for deer. I backed away and returned to the car. My hands shook as I loaded the last of my gear. I did not start the engine yet. I scanned the trees and the spur road. I looked at the reflective tape again. In daylight it was obvious. It faced the clearing, angled slightly down, placed where a person standing in the dark would catch it with a headlamp. It was not meant for drivers. It was meant to mark the center. I drove out and did not stop until I reached pavement. At a small town, I pulled into a gas station and used the restroom to wash my hands. The clerk barely looked up. I bought coffee and sat in the car thinking. The sound from the night replayed with new meaning. I did not report it right away. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself I did not want questions. Later that day, after I had slept in a rest area, I went back to the library and pulled up the same map. The number on the post matched a site that had been decommissioned years earlier. It was no longer listed as open. The note said access blocked. The spur road was not marked on newer maps. I found a phone number for the local Forest Service office and called. I described the site without naming it, described the ring and the hide. I did not give my name. The person on the line asked if I saw anyone. I said no. They said they would send someone. 2 days later, I drove back past the turnoff out of a need I did not understand. The spur road had fresh tire tracks and a temporary barrier made of tape and stakes. A white truck was parked near the post. I did not stop. Weeks later, after I was back at my parents' place, I saw a short notice online about an arrest in northern Idaho. An illegal poaching operation had been discovered on public land. The suspect had been using a closed campsite to butcher animals at night to avoid detection. He dragged hides around the clearing to lay scent and to check for human presence by smoothing the ground. The reflective tape marked his working area. He believed the ring discouraged animals and people from crossing it without leaving obvious signs. He worked alone and came late, assuming no one would camp there. The pieces fit without effort. The emptiness of the woods made sense. The lack of insects came from blood and chemicals used to clean. The careful circle was a habit, not a threat meant for me, but it was no less unsettling. I had slept at the center of someone else's routine, one designed to hide harm. I never camped for free again without checking twice. I kept the map folded in a drawer for a long time, the faded number staring back at me. When I finally threw it away, I did not feel relief. I felt a dull gratitude that I had been unnoticed, that the ring had stayed a ring, and that morning had come when it did. I was 14 this summer. I went on that Boy Scout trip in the Ozarks. I had been in Scouts for a couple of years, and I liked the order of it. Wake up, eat breakfast, follow the schedule, earn badges, sleep in a tent that stayed mostly dry. We were supposed to be learning survival skills, practicing knots, hiking, and generally enjoying the forest in a safe, structured way. The adult leaders were experienced, organized, and meant to keep us out of trouble. It should have been safe, and at first it was. The campsite we stayed at was basic. There was a flat clearing near a creek, a fire ring, and enough space for the tents. The latrine was an old wooden structure set down a slope from the tents, a place that never really dried out even in mid-July. The air around it smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, the boards warped and soft underfoot. The first night passed without incident. We followed the usual routines. Lights out at 9, patrols checked the fire. Someone always made sure no one wandered off. The forest around us was thick and quiet, except for the occasional bird or the soft rustle of small animals. By the second night, the rhythm of the trip had settled in. I had my sleeping bag arranged just right, my flashlight within reach, and the night seemed like any other summer camp night. That's when it started, subtly, with one of the younger scouts. He had gone to the latrine and taken longer than usual. When he came back, he was pale and shaking, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't explain much, just that someone had been standing behind the latrine while he was inside. No one else had seen anyone. There was no flashlight beam, no figure, only the sound of breathing. It didn't sound heavy or labored. It was steady, quiet, deliberate. The next night, the same unease hung in the air. I noticed that whenever anyone left the tents to go to the latrine, they came back much faster than necessary, moving quickly, heads down, glancing around. Nobody admitted why, but the tension was visible. I started paying attention to the sounds outside our tent. The forest was alive with normal noises. Wind through the trees, leaves falling, branches creaking, but there were others. Footsteps, steady and pacing, that moved around the perimeter of our tents after lights out. They were deliberate, slow enough to be human, but always just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams when someone went out. At first, I told myself it was one of the older scouts trying to scare us, or maybe an animal. But the rhythm was wrong for a deer or raccoon. It was methodical, almost patient, and it didn't change, even when the forest noises swelled around it. The adults didn't notice, or they chose not to. They were occupied with schedules, checking on the scouts, making sure everyone had water and completed tasks. None of them questioned the missing scout's story, nor the strange way everyone avoided lingering outside at night. We stayed quiet, partly out of fear, partly because no one wanted to break the fragile sense of safety. On the third night, I took a walk to the latrine. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the pacing sounds and whispers of movement were tricks of the dark. The path down the slope was uneven, the grass slick with dew, the wooden boards of the latrine soft and damp underfoot. I paused, listening, and that's when I heard it. The breathing, just beyond the structure, low and steady. I froze. The night was warm and still, but the sound felt deliberate, almost intimate, like someone was close enough to hear me move but far enough not to be seen. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I turned quickly, keeping my eyes on the dim glow of our campsite, and ran back up the slope, careful not to slip in the grass. I didn't speak of it to anyone. The next day, I noticed the older scouts seemed quieter, more alert, and the adults more distracted than usual. We hiked further that afternoon, but the forest felt heavier, like it was watching us. Shadows from the trees seemed longer, and the wind carried odd sounds, faint, distant, almost like footsteps but inconsistent, never quite matching our own. At camp that evening, we were careful to stay close together. I found myself lingering near the fire ring, listening, trying to convince myself the noises were nothing more than the forest. But they weren't. I could hear pacing outside, moving methodically around the edge of the tents, sometimes slowing, sometimes stopping, always deliberate. By the fourth night, the unease had become unbearable. Every time someone went to the latrine, we all tensed, anticipating their quick return. The sound of footsteps outside was constant, a low rhythm in the background. I didn't sleep. I lay on my back, eyes wide, counting the beats of the footsteps against my heartbeat. They never stopped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a ranger checking the site, maybe an older scout hiding in the shadows. But the sound had been there from the first night, before anyone mentioned seeing anything strange. I knew it wasn't a prank. The rhythm was too consistent, too precise. We left the next morning. The adults made no mention of the nights before, and none of the scouts brought it up. It was understood. We didn't talk about it. We packed up silently, carried our packs to the trailhead, and left the campsite behind. The forest seemed lighter once we were on the road, the trees receding, the creek shrinking in the distance. The unease stayed with me for years, a memory of a place that should have been safe, of a routine and structured trip turned quietly threatening by something no one could identify. I later learned that the campground had been shut down quietly in the early 2000s. There was no announcement, no news story, just an erasure from maps. Rangers avoided talking about it. No explanation was ever offered. I wondered if it had always been like that, if the site had a history, or if someone had simply decided it was too risky to leave open. The idea of people walking the trails, unknowingly approaching that slope and the latrine, made the hair on my arms rise. Even now, I remember the sound clearly, the low, steady breathing, the pacing around the tents, the way the forest seemed to hold its own secrets. It was a lesson in how quickly the familiar can become unfamiliar, in how a place designed for safety can harbor unease without ever revealing the source. I never went back. I don't know who or what caused it, only that it was real, grounded in the ordinary world, and entirely unexplainable. The memory of those nights stayed with me long after the badges and the campfire songs faded, a small but persistent shadow of a summer in the Ozarks that nobody talks about. I agreed to go camping with her because it sounded different. A first date in the middle of the redwoods, just the two of us, seemed like a way to skip the awkward coffee shop or restaurant routine. Neither of us had done much camping, and I thought it could be romantic, something quiet, green, and away from everything else. We drove north from the city, the road narrowing as the trees grew taller, the air cooler and damp, smelling of moss and old bark. The sky was a muted gray, the sun filtering through high clouds, and the occasional streak of fog curled between the trunks. By the time we reached the campground, the sun was low in the afternoon, and the light through the redwoods was soft and muted, turning the forest into a kind of green cathedral. The campground was empty when we arrived. The posted rules said there was a host on duty, but there was no one in sight. We set up our tent on a flat clearing just off the main loop, the ground soft underfoot and littered with pine needles. I hammered the stakes in as she unpacked the small cooler we had brought. There were only a few other sights visible through the trees, all empty. A sense of isolation settled over us, and at first it felt peaceful. Birds flitted through the canopy, small rustlings in the underbrush hinted at deer or raccoons moving through the shade. We ate simple sandwiches and watched the light fade through the trees, feeling like it was just the two of us in the world. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. Shadows deepened between the tree trunks, and the usual sounds of the forest became sharper and more noticeable. Somewhere far away, a creek gurgled over rocks. The wind moved through the canopy with a low, sighing sound. I started a small fire, enough to give us warmth and light without drawing attention, thinking it might add to the atmosphere. She leaned back on a blanket, watching the flames, and I felt a little thrill at how alone we were, how different this was from anything else we had done. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. There was a cough, wet and ragged, coming from somewhere among the trees beyond our clearing. Not a single cough, but a series of them, slow, painful, deliberate. I stopped moving, trying to figure out where it was. It didn't sound close at first, just somewhere deeper in the forest, but over the next few minutes it moved, or at least seemed to. Closer, then farther, then closer again. There was no rhythm I could predict. I wanted to think it was another camper, maybe someone sick, but the campground felt empty, and the way the sound moved didn't make sense. It was uneven, almost as if the person coughing was walking in irregular patterns. We tried to ignore it at first, sitting closer to the fire, pretending it didn't exist, but it didn't stop. Each cough sounded wet and strained, like someone in real pain. It was impossible not to notice. I kept glancing into the dark trees, trying to see a flashlight or a silhouette, but there was nothing. Only the occasional reflection of moonlight on leaves and the shifting shadows of branches. The coughing would stop for a moment, then start again, sometimes just a few steps away from the tent, sometimes back in the distance. There was a tense, low kind of suspense building, something you feel in a forest at night when the isolation makes every noise feel amplified. I considered going to check on the other sites, maybe see if anyone else was around, but the thought of leaving the tent felt foolish. She didn't say anything, just held herself a little closer to the blanket, and I didn't speak either. We stayed there, listening to the coughs, hearing them shift through the dark, hearing our own breathing in response. Hours passed this way, though I didn't check my watch. The sky darkened completely, and the canopy blocked what little moonlight there might have been. The sound of the coughs became almost a background rhythm, unpredictable and low, fading into the distance, returning, moving around us. Eventually, we both fell into uneasy sleep, waking intermittently whenever a cough sounded particularly close, tense and alert, listening for anything else. In the morning, I woke to birdsong and a faint mist that had settled over the clearing. The air smelled of damp needles and wet soil. I stepped out of the tent and glanced around, trying to locate where the sounds had come from. That's when I noticed the hollow log on the far side of our site. It was a large, decaying trunk, hollowed out from the inside, lying on the forest floor. As I stepped closer, my stomach sank. Dozens of used tissues had been shoved into the hollow, damp and messy, some streaked with blood, some soggy from rain. They were fresh. The realization hit slowly and unnervingly. The coughs had come from someone very near us, and they had spent the night close to our tent, hidden in the forest. I told her to stay back as I scanned the surrounding area. There was no one else in sight, no footprints in the soft soil besides our own. The other sites were empty. The campground, supposedly staffed, showed no signs of a host. We packed quickly, keeping our eyes on the forest as we moved. On the way out, we stopped at the host station, hoping for someone, anything, to explain what had happened. The building was empty. Mail had piled up in stacks, some of it months old. Notices on the door were faded and yellowed. The place hadn't been checked in a long time. No one had been in charge for months, if ever. The whole area was abandoned in practice, even if it wasn't officially. The drive back was quiet. The forest receded behind us, the road widening, the light brightening, and I felt relief just leaving it behind. We never spoke about the coughing in detail, just small observations about the tissues, the empty host station, the isolation. It was uncomfortable, and it lingered in my mind for weeks after. The trip had been intended as romantic, a way to bond in the quiet of the redwoods, but the reality of being alone with an unknown presence in a dark forest made it tense and strange. Even weeks later, I thought about the hollow log and those coughs, the way they seemed to move around us, deliberate yet unseen. It was an encounter that was entirely mundane, entirely human, but it carried a weight because of the isolation, because of how little control we had, because of how empty and abandoned the place really was. The forest itself wasn't threatening, the sounds weren't supernatural, but the sense of being observed, of someone living in the shadows just beyond what we could see, had left a mark. The campsite itself was perfectly ordinary by daylight, the trees majestic and still, but the night had changed it, had shown it as a place where a person could be alone and still feel watched. We never returned to that campground. The first date ended quietly, with a drive home and a mutual sense of relief at being back in the city. It wasn't dramatic, nothing happened to us physically, but it left an impression neither of us wanted to revisit. The forest stayed beautiful in memory, but with a note of tension. I sometimes think about those redwoods, the hollow log, the coughs moving through the darkness, and it reminds me how quickly isolation can change an ordinary place into something unsettling. Even in a peaceful, quiet forest, with no one else in sight, the presence of another human being, even hidden and harmless, can make every sound feel like a warning. It was a simple, quiet horror, entirely real and entirely human. That trip stayed with me not because of fear of animals, accidents, or nature, but because of the unpredictability of people and the isolation of a place meant to feel safe. The empty host station, the tissues, the endless coughs, all of it made the night longer and heavier than it needed to be. In retrospect, the lesson was clear. The wilderness isn't threatening on its own, but being completely alone with the unknown can make even a first date feel like walking on thin ice. It was a bad idea, yes, but it was also unforgettable. We drove away, the redwoods behind us, the forest quiet once more, and the memory of that night stayed sharp, like the sound of wet coughs moving through the dark, entirely real, entirely human, and impossible to ignore. I needed to get away. My house felt wrong in its emptiness, too quiet, too orderly. Every room reminded me that the life I had built, the life I thought I had, was gone. It wasn't that I wanted to disappear, not completely. I just wanted a few days where nothing reminded me of what I'd lost. The idea of being alone in the Olympic Peninsula, hiking into a primitive campsite near the coast, sounded like the kind of solitude I could survive in. A place where the forest opened suddenly onto gray water and driftwood, where I could watch the tide come and go without someone asking me to do laundry or fix a leaky faucet. The tide chart said I was safe, so I double-checked. I packed light, careful to bring a small tent, sleeping bag, and enough food for 2 nights. No distractions, no technology beyond a headlamp and a GPS. I told no one exactly where I was going. I didn't want to explain why. The hike-in was steeper than I expected. Trees closed in around the narrow trail, their roots twisting up and over the wet soil. Moss coated every rock, and the smell of salt mixed with damp would hung in the air. I felt exposed in a way that was comforting. The world behind me, the papers I'd signed, the boxes I'd packed, the silence of my empty house, disappeared with every step deeper into the forest. After an hour, the trees opened up, and I saw the water spread out before me. Gray, endless, littered with driftwood and small rocks polished by the tide. The campsite was little more than a flat stretch of sand, with a few sheltered spots among the trees. I picked a place near a cluster of fallen logs, clear of the main debris line, but close enough to hear the waves. The first night passed without incident. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed over my portable stove and watched the tide pull driftwood in and out. The sound of the ocean was hypnotic. I slept well, cocooned in my tent, the only interruptions the occasional gust of wind rattling the trees above. I woke once to adjust my sleeping bag, but that was it. The second night felt different. The day had been overcast, the air damp, and I noticed the wind had picked up after sunset. I went to sleep later than usual, exhausted from the hike back to the water's edge to collect driftwood for my small fire. Around 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly. My tent was vibrating slightly, a subtle brushing against the fabric. At first I thought it was the wind, but the motion was too precise, too deliberate. It moved across the surface of the tent in soft, brushing swipes, like fingers scanning the material. I froze listening. The waves kept their rhythm, indifferent, and the wind had softened. I could hear sand shifting, and that's when I noticed something, footsteps, faint but clear, dragging across the wet sand outside. I unzipped the tent quietly, careful not to make a sound. The sky was a deep gray, clouds pressing low against the horizon. The tide had receded, leaving smooth, wet sand behind. Footprints ran from the waterline straight to my tent. They stopped inches from the fabric, perfectly aligned, unnaturally long, the toes too evenly spaced. My first thought was a trick of perspective, but no. I traced them with my eyes. They didn't continue toward the trees, didn't return to the ocean. They ended just there, as if whoever, or whatever, had stopped to watch me sleep. I stared for a long time, my heart beat loud in the quiet. My mind went over possibilities. Hiker? Unlikely. The trail-in was barely wide enough for one person, and there had been no other footprints in the area. Animal? Nothing I knew left marks like that in sand. I crouched, examining the prints. They were shallow except for one, pressed close to where my head had been when I slept. Deeper, almost like someone leaned down, studying me, considering something. I stayed awake until first light. Every sound, the waves, the creak of the driftwood, a distant gull, kept me alert. When the sun finally touched the horizon, I unzipped my tent fully and stepped outside. The tide had begun its slow return. Most of the footprints were gone, erased by the water, but the one impression remained. The deeper mark beside my head was partially submerged, a reminder that someone had been there, right at my head, long enough to press down and leave a distinct impression. I walked the perimeter of the site, checking the tree line and the scattered logs. No signs of recent passage, no gear, no trash. Just the rhythm of the tide and the wind in the trees. I packed quickly, leaving behind my fire and the small pile of driftwood I'd gathered. The hike out was tense. Every crack of a branch, every flapping leaf drew my attention. My mind traced the footprints over and over, trying to find a logical explanation. A prankster? Too remote. Someone camping elsewhere? Too precise, too intimate, like they had studied the spot. Every scenario seemed plausible and impossible at the same time. By the time I reached my car, parked where the trail narrowed, the sky had brightened. Sunlight glinted off wet foliage, and the scent of salt and pine filled the air. I sat for a moment on the hood, breathing, trying to release the tension in my shoulders. I couldn't explain the footprints, the impression, the brushing against the tent. But I could explain the lesson. Solitude comes with a cost. There's a vulnerability to being completely alone, to leaving the noise of life behind and stepping into a space where no one is watching, but someone could be. I drove home slowly, keeping the windows down despite the chill. The road wound through the forest, then flattened out into the usual pattern of suburban development. The ordinary world returned, with traffic lights and morning commuters, and I felt a weight lift. At home, my house was still empty, still quiet, but I noticed the difference. I had been reminded of how fragile solitude can be, how careful one must be when seeking it. I locked the door behind me, unpacked my bag, and made coffee. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints, didn't post about the campsite or the strange impression. I didn't need anyone to validate it. It had happened, and that was enough. In the following days, I kept thinking about the deep impression near my head. I tried to rationalize it, replayed the hike, replayed the tide charts, considered the possibility of driftwood shifting in a certain way, an animal pressing down with weight, or sand forming an unusual indentation. None of it fully explained what I saw. Still, life went on. I returned to work, returned to routine, returned to normalcy. But I knew that weekend in the Olympic Peninsula had changed me. It had shown me the fragility of quiet, the vulnerability of exposure, and the strange, intimate way nature, and perhaps something else, can remind you that even when you think you are alone, you might not be. I have returned to the coast since then, always in groups, always with people who leave tracks and voices behind. I still see the tide charts, still look at driftwood, still hike the trails. But I never, ever camped alone near the water again. The impression is still in my mind, a reminder that the world can be vast and quiet, and still somewhere close by, someone or something might be watching. I remember the trip clearly, though it's been over a decade. It was September 2009, and my friend Jason and I had decided to head into the Montana backcountry for a fishing trip. We wanted something quiet, away from roads and the crowds, just a stretch of river with some room to cast and a chance to catch trout. The planning had been simple. We looked at stream gauges online, checked a few forums for recent conditions, packed our gear, and drove to the trailhead with the usual mix of excitement and nerves that comes with heading into the wilderness. The air was sharp and dry as we unloaded our packs, and the sun was already low enough in the sky to make the shadows long across the forest floor. The river itself was immediately off. From the map it should have been running full, rushing past rocks and gravel bars, but instead it was sluggish and shallow. Mud banks that should have been underwater were exposed, cracked in some places, soft and sticky in others, and the smell hit us before we even set foot in the stream. It wasn't fresh dirt or the usual scent of water and pine. It was sour, like something had been sitting in it for weeks. Fish were still moving, small trout skimming near the deeper pockets, but there were fewer than we expected, and the ones we hooked were sluggish, fighting lazily instead of with the usual wild energy. Our first night we camped close to the riverbank, close enough that the sound of the water normally lulled us to sleep. The low water changed everything. Instead of rushing over rocks, it whispered across exposed mud flats. In the middle of the night, I woke once, thinking I heard something in the river, a splash upstream. It was rhythmic, slow, almost deliberate, not a natural gurgle or drip. I tried to convince myself it was a beaver or an elk, something ordinary. By the time I blinked and focused, nothing had floated past. No leaves, no sticks, no ripple in the surface, nothing that could have caused the sound to travel downstream. It felt like someone had walked through it and then vanished. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of sleep and shadow. Jason had the same uneasy feeling. He didn't say much, but later he admitted he had heard the same sound. The next day we hiked upstream a few miles to a stretch of river that looked like it might hold more fish. The mud was deeper there, sticky in places and hard in others. Every step left prints, and we joked that our boots were leaving more evidence than our fishing rods were catching fish. The river still smelled sour, and the low water revealed tree roots and stumps we never would have seen otherwise. A few times, I saw what I thought were rocks shifting under the water, but there was no current to move them. I kept seeing them or thinking I did, and then they were gone, like someone had touched them and disappeared. That night, Jason woke me, whispering about a sound. He said he'd heard someone walking in the river, barefoot, slow, dragging their feet across the mud. He didn't see anything, but the rhythm had been precise, deliberate. I told him it was probably an elk, a large one moving cautiously in the shallow water, though I couldn't say it with confidence. We lay awake listening, straining to hear anything more, but the river was still again, except for a faint, occasional drip. No splash, no crunch, nothing that could explain the memory of that sound. In the morning, the low river revealed something neither of us were expecting. In the mud near the center of the river, half a dozen human-shaped footprints were pressed into the muck. The toes, the arches, the heels, they were unmistakably human. They were perfectly formed, like someone had stepped carefully through the sludge. But they stopped abruptly midstream, halfway between the banks, with no signs of wading further or leaving the water. No drag marks. No displacement of the mud beyond the footprints. It was as if whoever had stepped there had sunk straight into the river, leaving no trace of movement beyond that point. I stared at them for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a sinkhole, a quicksand-like patch in the mud, or a log that had shifted under the water. But there was nothing beneath the surface. I prodded gently with my boot. The mud was soft, but not soft enough to swallow a person whole. And the prints were still there, perfectly shaped, leading to nothing. Jason and I didn't speak much about it. We packed up slowly, moving upstream along the bank, fishing a little more cautiously, checking for any other footprints or signs of movement. There were none. The rest of the river looked normal enough, apart from the low water and the sour smell. Every time I glanced at the river, it seemed quiet in a way it shouldn't have been. No birds, no insects near the mud, no movement at all apart from the sluggish water. We didn't see anyone else in the backcountry that trip. No other campers, no hikers, no fishermen. We moved slowly, keeping the river on our right, careful to avoid any deeper mud pockets. Every splash we heard from the stream we assumed could be a fish or a rock, but neither of us could shake the memory of those prints, or the rhythmic sound Jason heard at night. On the last day, as we packed and prepared to hike out, I took one more look at the river. The low water revealed a stretch of the riverbed I hadn't noticed before, a shallow area where the current should have been strong enough to carry sticks and leaves. Instead, it was eerily still. The mud there was darker than anywhere else, damp down to a foot or more, with depressions that didn't resemble anything we recognized. We didn't linger. We hiked back to the trailhead, fishing rods slung over our shoulders, boots caked in sticky mud. The drive back was quiet. Neither of us spoke much. Years later, I still think about that stretch of river. I've been back to Montana many times since, but never to that particular unnamed river. I looked at stream gauges and maps online, but the river was always full and rushing now. I've wondered about the footprints, the sounds, and the way the mud seemed to swallow anything that stepped into it. I've told the story a few times, always to a small audience, and everyone wants it to be something more dramatic, something supernatural or unexplainable. But I know what I saw, and I know what Jason heard. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It wasn't anything like that. It was just a river, lower than it should have been, revealing things that had always been there, things you don't usually notice, things that can disappear before anyone sees them. That stretch of water and mud left an impression I haven't forgotten, and I doubt I ever will. The river was wrong, the footprints were real, and the memory of that quiet, sour-smelling backcountry will stay with me longer than any fish I caught or trail I hiked. I remember driving into the desert that April evening in 1999. The sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the jagged terrain, and the air smelled dry and sharp. We were a group of 5, each of us carrying gear that had been meticulously packed over the weeks leading up to the trip. The plan was simple: find a quiet site, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. We weren't looking for anything more than isolation, the kind of desert silence that swallowed everything else, where the wind itself felt like a presence. We turned off the main dirt road onto a narrow track, bouncing over ruts and loose gravel. The ground under the tires was uneven, littered with fragments of rock that caught the headlights in glinting flashes. Our pace slowed naturally as we neared the coordinates we had marked on the map. This area wasn't on any standard trail list, and that was exactly why we wanted it. The idea of being completely alone in the open expanse of sand and scrub was exhilarating. When we finally arrived, the sight was unmistakable. We had expected a flat patch of dirt, maybe some scrubby bushes, rocks to mark corners. Instead, we found a tent already set up. It was small and simple, an olive-colored dome pitched perfectly on a cleared stretch of ground. The rainfly was taut, stakes hammered in deep, and the guy lines angled just so. Inside, we could see sleeping bags laid out neatly, zipped closed and aligned with precision. It wasn't just a tent someone had abandoned. It looked like it had been prepared for someone to arrive. But there was no car, no footprints, no campfire, no sign that anyone had passed through recently. We circled it slowly, our flashlights sweeping over the area. Every instinct told us to leave, to drive on until we found a site that wasn't set up for us. But something about it held our attention. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, the desert stillness, the way the sun had fallen low enough that shadows stretched across the flat earth like fingers. We decided to stay. We pitched our own tent a few yards away, ignoring the tension in our chests and the uneasy quiet that hung over the site. As we moved through the routine of setting up, we noticed small things. A bit of sand brushed against the tent fabric as if someone had walked past. A faint indentation in the dirt nearby, barely noticeable, as though someone had knelt there for a moment. The wind was picking up, carrying the dry smell of desert dust and a faint metallic tang that none of us could identify. The tent across from ours seemed almost to settle into the ground, still and ready, as if it were waiting. Night fell quickly. The desert is merciless in how darkness spreads. One moment there is orange twilight, and the next, a blackness that makes the horizon disappear. We cooked a small dinner on the portable stove, the flames hissing and sputtering against the dry wind. We laughed quietly, but the sound felt thin. Shadows from the nearby scrub bounced unnaturally, stretched across the sand in the firelight. Eventually, we crawled into our tent, the night air turning cold against our skin. Somewhere after midnight, the sound began. At first it was just a faint zipper, the soft pull of fabric against metal. We froze. It came again, slow, deliberate, close enough that it could have been someone right next to the tent. There were no voices, no footsteps, no movement in the scrub, just that zipper sound opening and closing in a rhythm that made our stomachs tighten. We didn't move, didn't speak. Each of us listened as the zippers repeated their soft, mechanical noise, always nearby, never approaching, never leaving. The tension stretched for what felt like hours, our breathing shallow, each snap of a twig outside making us flinch. Dawn broke pale and fragile, a thin light creeping across the horizon. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt different from the night. We unzipped our tent and looked toward the site that had caused so much unease. The tent was gone. No trace remained. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Just a flat patch of earth, compressed slightly as if a body of canvas and poles had been lying there for a while, then vanished. We inspected the ground carefully, every stone turned, every tuft of scrub examined. Nothing explained it. We packed up silently, each of us unwilling to talk first, the memory of the zipper sounds still clinging to our minds. Driving away, we argued quietly, each suggesting possibilities, none of them satisfying. Someone must have been there, but how? There was no vehicle, no tracks. Could it have been a prank? But who would go to such lengths in that remote desert, setting a tent perfectly and leaving it alone in silence? Some of us speculated it was a rental from a ranger or another group, but the timing, the precision didn't fit. The entire area was off limits except to those who hiked in from miles away, and no one else had been on that road. For years, we would debate it every time someone mentioned camping in the desert. We'd pull out maps, compare notes, recall the subtle details, the way the wind shifted, the exact position of the shadows, the crisp outline of the sleeping bags. No one has ever given a satisfying answer. The memory never fades. Even now, thinking back, I can hear the soft, deliberate zippers, feel the compressed sand under my fingers where the tent had lain, smell the dry desert air with that faint metallic note I still can't identify. The thing about that night is how real it was. There was no fantasy, no leap to something impossible, no explanation that involved the desert itself being alive or haunted. It was perfectly ordinary in every way except for one. A tent, fully set up, waiting for us, then gone by morning with no trace of who might have put it there or why. We stayed, we heard it, we saw it, and then it disappeared. Everything else, our own tent, our food, the wind, the desert, was as ordinary as always. We left the site quietly, our gear packed, the early sun casting long, pale shadows across the sand. None of us spoke much on the drive back. There was a weight to the morning that hung over the car, a shared understanding that what we had seen didn't make sense, but it had been entirely real. In the years since, we've revisited the story in fragments, trying to reconstruct every step, every sight, every sound. Some nights, alone at home, I can still feel the tension, the hollow quiet, and hear the faint zip of a zipper somewhere just out of reach. We still argue about whether the tent was ever there at all. Every time one of us suggests maybe we imagined it, someone else remembers details the others hadn't noticed. The way the sleeping bags were aligned, the tension of the rainfly, the exact soft sound of fabric against metal. It happened. It is the only certainty. Everything else about it, all the questions, remains unresolved, and that unresolvedness lingers heavier than any explanation could ever carry. October 2004, Central Pennsylvania. We were seniors in high school and restless, wanting a weekend that felt like ours alone. No parents, no cell phones, no one checking up on us. This was before smartphones, before anyone could trace your steps. We left a note at home that simply said camping, nothing more. It wasn't a lie exactly, just vague enough to give us space. We loaded my old Honda with tents, sleeping bags, a cooler, and whatever we could carry, and drove until the pavement ended and the trees closed in around us. The trailhead was almost invisible, a narrow gravel pull-off overgrown with weeds. A faded sign said something like State Forest Access, but it looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. We parked, strapped on our packs, and followed a rough track that quickly became nothing more than a narrow path through the undergrowth. 2 miles in, the woods grew denser, the canopy heavier. The light was already dimming, and the creek we were aiming for appeared as a silver ribbon through the trees. We set up our tents near the bank, where moss covered the rocks and the water ran shallow but fast. The first night was peaceful, the kind of calm that makes the edges of the woods feel distant. The creek was loud enough to mask most sounds, so even the occasional animal call felt removed. We cooked over a small fire, the smell of charred hot dogs mixing with damp leaves and pine. One of the guys joked that it felt like a place where people went to disappear. We laughed, but there was a shiver in the joke, a small pulse of unease that none of us admitted out loud. The next day passed slowly. We fished a little, went deeper into the woods, kicked through leaves, and tried to keep track of time without watches. The forest had its own rhythm, and we were outsiders trying to move through it. As the sun sank, we returned to camp, and that's when we first noticed something odd. A faint murmur carried from deeper in the trees, laughter that didn't match ours, and a radio playing something we couldn't place. We called back, shouting, and the noise stopped instantly. Silence stretched so long that it felt alive, pressing in. We waited for footsteps, the snap of twigs, anything, but nothing came. That night, the wind shifted. It was still, but the trees seemed restless. Around midnight, one of us heard it first, a voice. At first it was subtle, a low murmur through the darkness. Then it became clearer, unmistakable. It was one of my friend's voices, his laugh, the way he said his nickname. It echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, slightly delayed, like a recording playing back imperfectly. I froze, straining to hear. The others heard it too. We stayed in our tents, listening as it repeated, calling him again and again, each time with a fraction of a second difference, slightly off, but familiar enough to make the stomach tighten. We didn't leave the tents. We couldn't. The fire had burned down to embers. The creek's chatter felt distant, and the trees seemed thicker, closer. The sound moved subtly, circling, always just out of reach, never breaking into footsteps, never letting itself be seen. Every time one of us tried to speak, the voice would pause, then start again, calling the same nickname, mimicking the laugh exactly. It wasn't mocking exactly. It was deliberate, patient. We spent the rest of the night listening, unable to sleep, muscles tense. Dawn came slowly, pale light filtering through the leaves, turning the dew on the rocks into tiny mirrors. We packed quietly, no one speaking, moving mechanically, each of us avoiding eye contact with the others. When we were ready, I suggested we take a final walk to the creek. We needed to see the place clearly, to check for tracks, anything that would explain the sounds. At the edge of the camp, near where the tents had been, we found cigarette butts, crushed and scattered. Food wrappers lay in half-buried piles, sodden and stuck to the leaves. None of us smoked. None of us had left wrappers anywhere. We hadn't seen anyone at the trailhead or along the path. The items were fresh enough to be recent, but not in a pattern that suggested casual campers. It was deliberate, left along the edges of where we slept. Something had been here while we were asleep, watching, maybe waiting, maybe practicing. We moved quickly after that, carrying everything back to the car. The forest felt different in the light, safer but heavier, as if it had absorbed the night's tension and was holding it, ready to release it again. The drive out was silent except for the engine and the gravel under the tires. None of us spoke of the voice or the cigarette butts. We didn't need to. The forest had said enough. That weekend stayed with us. Years later, we would tell fragments of the story, usually leaving out the voice, but the unease lingered. The state forest was big enough that the area we camped in would never see many people, maybe no one else at all. Whatever had been there was patient, precise, and utterly human. Not supernatural, just someone or multiple people who had chosen that quiet, hidden place to watch, to learn, to be unseen. We never went back. We never marked the trailhead again. The note we left at home seemed foolish in retrospect, not enough to explain our absence, and too vague to matter. What stayed with me was the sound of that voice, perfectly imitated, circling through the trees like it belonged there more than we did, and the simple fact that at dawn, evidence of someone else's presence was all around us, ordinary, human, and terrifying in its quiet inevitability. We didn't tell anyone where we had gone, and we never needed to. The memory was ours alone, locked in the details, the creek, the fire, the way the air shifted at night, the cigarette butts, and the laugh that was not a laugh, but something far more unsettling. It wasn't the forest that made it scary. It wasn't the dark or the isolation. It was the realization that someone had been there, close enough to mimic us, close enough to touch our space, and that we had never even noticed. The night ended, the forest receded behind us, and the world returned, but the sense of being watched, of someone knowing us before we even saw them, stayed. We left with our gear, our silence, and a story that, even 15 years later, could still make my stomach tighten. I wanted to spend a few days alone in the Adirondacks in January, mostly to test my winter gear and to see how well I could manage a solo trip in deep snow. The forecast had promised clear skies and sub-zero temperatures, the kind of cold that makes the forest quiet and heavy. I packed light but carefully, 4-season tent, insulated sleeping bag, small stove, and just enough food for 3 days. I drove as far as the trailhead would allow, then strapped on my snowshoes and hiked into the woods, following a frozen logging road that eventually narrowed into a trail buried under a thick blanket of snow. By late afternoon, I found a clearing with enough flat ground to pitch my shelter. The trees around it were bare except for heavy snow on their branches, and the entire place felt contained, like the snow had pressed a seal over the forest. I set up the tent with precision, making sure the vestibule could hold firewood and my stove safely. The snow was soft, but compact enough that my stakes held firm. I layered insulation on the ground, laid out my sleeping bag, and cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated soup. The forest was silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound startling. Even the wind seemed to have been muffled by the snow. By 9, I was inside my bag, warm enough but alert to the absolute stillness around me. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a faint noise. It was subtle at first, a crunching almost imperceptible against the snow, but I realized it was footsteps. Someone walking. The sound was just outside the tent, or close enough that it made the snow beneath the trees shift with tiny pops. I held still, listening. The crunching moved slowly, deliberately, in a wide arc that seemed to circle my shelter. I counted the pattern, trying to rationalize it as a wandering deer or a fox, but animals don't walk in circles around a single spot, especially not in perfect, measured steps. The sound went on for a while, stopping and starting again, never approaching the tent directly, never leaving a straight path. I didn't move, not wanting to make any noise, but I could feel my heart rate climbing. Every breath I took seemed loud, and my snowshoes left impressions in the snow I could just make out under the thin light of a half-moon. I tried to tell myself it was someone else hiking, a snowmobiler lost or a hunter, but there were no roads for miles, and the nearest cabin was well over 2 miles away. Whoever it was, they had no business being there, circling me like that. The footsteps continued for what felt like an hour. I lay in the tent, straining to hear them, feeling the cold creep in despite all my layers. Eventually the noise stopped, but the momentary silence was worse than the steps. I could hear faint shifts in the snow, as if the person, or whatever it was now stationary, just watching. I stared at the tent walls, feeling the isolation press in. The forest was supposed to be peaceful in winter, and I had counted on that to test my own endurance. Instead, it had turned tense, the calm replaced with something I couldn't place. I didn't sleep again, just listened, frozen beneath layers of down. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent slowly. The snow had shifted overnight, but more disturbingly, my own snowshoe tracks from the previous day were altered. They weren't just trampled, they were smeared, stretched into long, uneven lines, like someone had taken a brush and tried to copy them without lifting their feet. My path into the clearing had vanished under this strange distortion, as if someone had gone to great effort to cover their movements while leaving mine distorted. I scanned the surrounding trees, checking for footprints, but there were none that matched the pattern. Nothing else had moved, no broken branches or signs of passage. I felt a rising panic, cold in a different way than the air around me. Someone had been out here, someone who knew how to move silently, who could manipulate snow without leaving conventional tracks. That realization made the forest feel smaller, the clearing less like a safe space and more like a trap. I didn't linger. I left the tent as it was, half my gear packed, half left behind, not wanting to take the time to search or reorganize. I retraced the general direction I had come from, following a ridge I recognized from my maps and compass, keeping my snowshoes tight to my feet and moving quickly. The air burned my lungs, the cold biting at exposed skin, but it kept my mind sharp. I moved through the forest with a focus I hadn't needed when I set out, ignoring the beauty of the snow-covered pines, the way sunlight sparkled on ice-laden branches. Every shadow and bend in the trail felt suspect. The forest no longer seemed like a sanctuary. It felt like a place I had to navigate carefully, aware that someone, or something, had observed me, had manipulated the ground around my shelter, and had vanished without trace. By mid-morning, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was empty, just as it had been, and I didn't linger to think about it. I started the car, warmed it, and drove straight out of the mountains, leaving everything behind. The memory of the snowshoe prints, altered and dragged into those unnatural lines, stayed with me. I couldn't rationalize it fully. There was no explanation that fit neatly into reason. I had seen signs of human presence, but never caught anyone. The steps, the patterns, the way the snow had been handled, all of it was deliberate and impossible to dismiss. It was a simple winter trip, a test of gear and endurance, and it had been reduced to a single rule. When someone or something shows you the forest isn't empty, leave immediately. I never returned to that clearing. I left my tent, half my food, my stove, even my extra layers. Months later, I realized how easy it would have been to convince myself that the wilderness was safe until I had experienced the tangible evidence of someone else's presence. The Adirondacks were quiet, but quiet could be deceptive. Winter didn't just muffle sound, it could hide movement, hide intent, and create the perfect stage for someone to observe and manipulate a lone camper without ever revealing themselves. That morning, when I finally drove past the last ridge and out of the forest, I felt relief that was almost physical. I hadn't seen the person who altered the snow, but I knew they had been there, and that knowledge made all the difference. I never camped solo in that range again, and every time I think back, I picture those smeared lines stretching across the snow, and I understand why I left everything behind without question. I remember that summer of 1983 clearly, even now. I was 12, and every year my family went to my uncle's land in rural Kentucky. The place was a patchwork of fields, rolling hills, and thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly once you reached the edges of the cleared ground. My uncle always made a point of warning us about the tree line. He said it wasn't superstition, just respect. He didn't explain further, and we never pressed him. We had a cabin on the edge of his property when I was younger, but that summer we decided to camp on the open field near the creek, close enough to the old barn to get water, far enough to be quiet. Setting up the tents was hot and dusty. The air was heavy with the smell of dried grass and the faint tang of the creek water. I remember my uncle moving around the camp with purpose, checking lines, organizing firewood, and keeping a careful eye on the tree line. The sun sank low, brushing the horizon with orange and purple, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the field like long fingers. Everything felt alive, quiet in a way that made you listen harder. My cousins ran back and forth between the creek and the fire pit, laughing, but I stayed close to my uncle, helping him hammer tent stakes. He didn't talk much, only occasionally muttering about where the fire would burn best or how to stack wood without it falling. As night fell, the woods swallowed the last light. Crickets sang in thick rhythm, frogs croaked by the creek, and the distant hoot of an owl added depth to the silence. We made a small fire, the smoke spiraling straight up before twisting lazily along the breeze. My uncle sat on the edge of the fire, his eyes on the darkened tree line. There was nothing visible beyond the trunks, just shapes and shadows. I remember feeling a chill, not from the air, which was warm, but from the sense that we were being watched, though there was nothing to see. The firelight flickered across his face, and I noticed his jaw was tight, his fingers white against the wooden stock of his shotgun. I fell asleep inside my tent with the familiar comfort of my sleeping bag around me. But sometime after midnight, I woke to the fire glowing dimly outside the canvas. My uncle was there, sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed on the woods. The air had cooled, and the quiet was deeper than I remembered. I could hear the faint hiss of embers, the occasional rustle of leaves, but nothing beyond that. My heart was beating fast, but I stayed still, thinking I had dreamt him there. He did not move, and I realized he had been there for a long time. He didn't speak, only gestured with a slight nod to remain inside the tent. An hour passed, maybe more. I could hear the forest shift, subtle sounds at first, twigs snapping, a low movement that I couldn't identify. Then it came, a scream. It was high, ragged, and filled with a kind of raw intensity that I had never heard. It didn't sound like a human, not quite, though it carried the weight and desperation of one. It didn't sound like an animal either. No growl, no bark, no bird call. It was just sound, pure and frightening, vibrating through the ground beneath my tent. My hands went cold. I pressed my face to the zipper, straining to see, but the darkness was complete beyond the firelight. The scream didn't repeat, but the silence afterward was worse, heavy and expectant. Morning came slowly. The sky was pale, with hints of gold bleeding through the low clouds. I unzipped the tent, and the field looked ordinary, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The fire was reduced to blackened ashes, scattered in a way that seemed deliberate. My uncle moved around quietly, making no effort to explain anything. There was a sense of urgency in the way he packed the supplies, folding blankets, stowing food, dismantling the fire pit completely. We didn't eat breakfast. None of us wanted to. My cousins were subdued, unusually quiet, picking at cold cereal and granola bars with little appetite. We packed the tents and loaded the car slowly. My uncle worked methodically, scattering the ashes of the fire pit across the field and flattening the marks where the flames had burned. I remember him pausing occasionally to look back at the treeline, his expression unreadable, almost tense, and then continuing with his work. The forest seemed ordinary in the daylight, no longer threatening, but the memory of the scream lingered, sharp and unshakable. Driving away, the land fell behind us, green hills rolling into the distance, the barn and the creek disappearing from view. My uncle didn't say a word until we reached the main road. The only sound was the engine and the occasional bird calling from the roadside trees. He looked at each of us, but mostly at me, with a quiet seriousness, a weight I didn't understand fully at the time. We never camped on that land again. My uncle sold it a few years later, and the memories of that night stayed with me. I understand now why he emphasized respect, though he never told us what to fear exactly. It wasn't superstition, as he said, but caution, a recognition of something beyond ordinary observation. The woods had limits we weren't meant to cross unprepared, and his instinct to guard us was as precise as it was silent. I still remember the fire's glow against his face and the sound that shook the ground beneath me, and I carry the memory with the same clarity I had that night, the same sense that some things are best observed, never approached.